A simple elderly woman denied entry to court. Her husband, the Supreme Judge, walks in. Margaret Whittaker stood at the base of the marble steps leading to the Supreme Court building, clutching her small leather handbag. The Washington, D.C. morning was unseasonably cold for October, and she pulled her beige wool coat tighter around her slender frame. At 73, Margaret had never been one to draw attention to herself, preferring the quiet dignity that came with a lifetime of careful observation. The security line stretched around the corner, tourists and law students eager to witness the day's argument. Margaret had deliberately arrived early, hoping to avoid the crowds, but it seemed everyone else had the same idea. First time at the Supreme Court? Asked a young woman behind her, a law student judging by the heavy textbook under her arm. Margaret smiled politely. No, dear, I've been here many times. Oh, are you a lawyer? The young woman looked surprised, scanning Margaret's modest appearance. No, just an interested citizen, Margaret replied, the corner of her mouth turning up slightly. She'd learned long ago that there was power in understatement. As the line inched forward, Margaret thought about how Richard would already be inside, preparing for the day's proceedings. After 48 years of marriage, they still maintained certain traditions. On days when Richard heard cases, they traveled separately. He left at dawn, preferring to review his notes in the quiet solitude of his chambers. Margaret would follow later, slipping into the public gallery without fanfare. When she finally reached the security checkpoint, Margaret placed her handbag on the conveyor belt and stepped through the metal detector. The young guard frowned at her identification card. Ma'am, this isn't a valid ID for today's session. We need government-issued photo identification. Margaret's heart sank. I've been coming here for years. This has always been sufficient. The guard shook his head. New security protocols, ma'am. I can't make exceptions. Margaret felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment as people shifted impatiently behind her. She had left her driver's license at home, never imagining she would need it. For nearly 15 years, the staff had recognized her, nodding respectfully as she entered. Could you please check with your supervisor? She asked quietly. The guard's expression hardened. Ma'am, there are people waiting. Without proper identification, I'm going to have to ask you to step aside. As she stepped out of the line, a seasoned security officer approached. Mrs. Whittaker, is everything all right? Before she could answer, the young guard interjected, She doesn't have proper identification. The older officer looked uncomfortable. Ma'am, I'm sorry, but the rules are clear. Perhaps you could return home and come back with your ID. Margaret glanced at her watch. The session would begin soon, and their apartment was across town. I understand, she said quietly, dignity intact despite the burning embarrassment. Thank you for your time. As she turned to leave, Margaret heard a commotion at the staff entrance. A black SUV had pulled up, and several security personnel were assembling. She knew that vehicle, had ridden in it countless times. For a moment, she considered waiting, letting Richard solve this problem with a single word. But that wasn't their way. That had never been their way. Margaret straightened her shoulders and walked down the steps. Away from the building where her husband served as the most powerful judge in the country, a simple elderly woman turned away like any other citizen without proper credentials. Inside his chambers, Justice Richard Whittaker adjusted his reading glasses, reviewing his notes for the morning's arguments. His clerk, James Donovan, entered with a stack of briefs. The Solicitor General just arrived. Justice Whittaker, James said. And your coffee? Richard nodded his thanks. Any word from Mrs. Whittaker? She usually sends a message when she arrives. James shook his head. Not that I'm aware of, sir. Richard frowned slightly. Margaret was unfailingly punctual. He checked his watch. 20 minutes until the session began. Justice Whittaker. The Chief Justice asked if you could join her briefly before the session, James added. As he walked toward the Chief Justice's chambers, Richard noted the heightened security presence. The court had implemented new protocols following recent protests. He nodded to the guards he recognized, most of whom had served the court for years. The Chief Justice, Eleanor Harmon, looked up from her desk as he entered. "Richard, good morning. Ready for today?" "As always, Eleanor," he replied, taking a seat across from her. As they discussed the day's agenda, Richard's phone vibrated in his pocket. He excused himself to check it, something he rarely did during these pre-session meetings. It was a text from Margaret. "Denied entry. No proper ID. Heading home. Will watch the live stream. Love you." Richard stared at the message, a rare flash of anger rising in his typically composed demeanor. In 15 years, not once had Margaret used their relationship to gain special treatment, and now, because of some bureaucratic oversight, she had been turned away. "I apologize, Eleanor, but there's a situation I need to address," he said, rising from his chair. The Chief Justice raised an eyebrow. "Gert, the session begins in 15 minutes. Richard, I'm aware. I'll be on the bench on time." His tone left no room for discussion. Richard strode through the halls with purpose, his black robe flowing behind him. He reached the security area just as the morning rush of spectators was tapering off. "Justice Whittaker," the head of security said, surprised. "Is everything all right, sir?" "No, Frank, it isn't," Richard replied, his voice low but firm. "My wife was just denied entry because of insufficient identification. She has been coming to this court for 15 years. Every guard in this building knows who she is." Frank's face fell. "Sir, I wasn't informed. The new protocols require government-issued photo ID for all visitors, no exceptions. And who approved these protocols without ensuring the staff was properly trained to recognize long-standing court family members?" Richard asked, his anger contained but palpable. "I'll look into it immediately, sir," Frank assured him, visibly uncomfortable. Richard checked his watch. 10 minutes until the session began. "Please call Mrs. Whittaker and personally apologize. Then send a car to bring her back if she wishes to return." As Richard turned to leave, he spotted the young guard who had likely turned Margaret away. The young man stood rigid, eyes forward. Richard approached him, studying the name badge. "Officer Chen, is it?" "Yes, Justice Whittaker," the guard replied, standing even straighter. "You were following protocol, which is commendable," Richard said, his voice softer now. But the Supreme Court is not just a building of laws, it's a place of judgment and discernment. Remember that protocols serve people, not the other way around." As Richard walked back toward his chambers, he composed a text to Margaret. "Car coming for you. Your choice to return or stay home. Either way, I'll see you after the session. We should talk about this." Margaret sat in the back of the court-issued sedan, watching the familiar Washington landmarks pass by her window. After receiving Richard's text, she had briefly considered staying home. The humiliation of being turned away still stung, but something deeper compelled her to return. This wasn't about pride anymore. It was about principle. "Mrs. Whittaker, we're very sorry for the confusion," the driver said, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. "It's all right, Thomas," she replied, recognizing the longtime court driver. "Rules are important, but so is common sense," he muttered, turning onto Constitution Avenue. When they arrived at the court, Margaret was met by Frank Sullivan, the head of security, who personally escorted her through a side entrance. "Mrs. Whittaker, please accept my sincere apologies," he said, his discomfort evident. "Thank you, Frank, but I don't want special treatment," Margaret replied firmly. "I should have brought proper identification. The young officer was doing his job." Frank looked surprised at her response. "Tous still. We should have recognized you after all these years." "Perhaps," Margaret conceded. "But in times when institutions are under scrutiny, adherence to protocol matters more than ever." As they walked through the marble corridors, Margaret felt the familiar solemnity of the building envelop her. The session had already begun, but Frank led her to a reserved seat in the back of the gallery where she could slip in unobtrusively. From her position, Margaret could see Richard on the bench, His attention focused on the Solicitor General's arguments. To most observers, he appeared as he always did, attentive, occasionally making notes, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. But Margaret could detect the slight tension in his shoulders. He was bothered by what had happened, more than he would admit. During a brief recess, Margaret felt a presence beside her. It was Justice Elena Mendoza, who had slipped away from the bench to sit next to her momentarily. "Margaret, I just heard what happened," Elena whispered. "Ridiculous." Margaret shook her head slightly. "It's nothing, Elena. A misunderstanding." Richard was livid, Elena continued, a small smile playing at her lips. "I haven't seen him that focused since the Jenkins decision last term." "He shouldn't have made a fuss," Margaret replied, though she felt a warmth at the thought of Richard defending her. "Sometimes the system needs a little disruption to remember its humanity," Elena said, squeezing Margaret's hand before returning to the bench as the session resumed. As the arguments continued, Margaret observed the young law student she had met in line earlier, now sitting several rows ahead, completely absorbed in the proceedings. The young woman's enthusiasm reminded Margaret of herself decades ago, when she had first met Richard at Columbia Law. She had been researching for her master's thesis in history. He had been a promising young professor. Margaret had never aspired to be in the spotlight. When Richard was nominated to the federal bench early in his career, they had made a pact. His public service would never eclipse her identity or their private life together. When the Supreme Court nomination came 15 years ago, they had renewed that promise, even as they recognized how much their lives would change. As the session concluded for the day, Margaret quietly exited the gallery, avoiding the crowd. She made her way to the private area near Richard's chambers, where they had arranged to meet. While waiting, she encountered Officer Chen, the young guard who had denied her entry earlier. He looked mortified upon seeing her. "Mrs. Whitaker, I want to apologize for this morning. I should have—" Margaret interrupted him gently. "You did exactly what you were supposed to do. Don't apologize for following the rules." The young man looked confused, but Justice Whitaker said, "My husband and I don't always agree on everything," Margaret said with a small smile. "That's the secret to 48 years of marriage." As the young officer thanked her and departed, Margaret caught sight of Richard approaching, his robe now removed, looking once again like the man she had breakfast with that morning, rather than the formidable Justice Whitaker. His expression softened when he saw her. "You came back." "Of course I did," Margaret replied. "When have I ever missed an opening argument?" Richard took her hand, a rare public display of affection within these walls. "We need to talk about what happened." Their apartment in Georgetown was a sanctuary, deliberately separate from the official residences favored by other Washington power players. Richard and Margaret had purchased it 30 years ago, long before his Supreme Court nomination. As Margaret prepared dinner, Richard opened a bottle of Cabernet, their usual end-of-day ritual. "Elena mentioned you were quite upset," Margaret said, chopping vegetables with practiced efficiency. Richard leaned against the counter, watching her. "You should never have been treated that way." "I forgot my ID, Richard. The rules apply to everyone. The rules should be applied with judgment," he countered. "Every security officer in that building knows who you are." Margaret set down her knife and turned to face him. "And that's precisely why I needed to be treated like anyone else. Do you remember what you told me when you were nominated? The moment we start expecting special treatment is the moment I become unfit for the bench." Richard sighed, recognizing his own words. "That was about maintaining our integrity, not about you being humiliated at a security checkpoint." "It's all connected," Margaret insisted. "The court's legitimacy depends on the perception that no one is above its rules, not even the justices or their families." They moved to the small dining table by the window overlooking the Potomac. The city lights reflected on the water, a view they had cherished through administrations and court terms. "I've been thinking about this all day," Richard admitted, serving the wine. "Not just about what happened, but about what it represents." Margaret waited, knowing her husband's deliberate way of building an argument. The court is facing its greatest crisis of legitimacy in decades, he continued. Public trust is eroding. Every decision is scrutinized through a political lens rather than a legal one. And in response, we've fortified ourselves, literally and figuratively. More security, more distance, more isolation from the very public we serve. The checkpoint incident was a symptom, not the disease, Margaret suggested. Richard nodded. Exactly. We've created a fortress, physically and institutionally. The new security protocols are just one manifestation. As they ate, Margaret thought about Officer Chen and his strict adherence to the rules. The young man who turned me away was just following orders, she said, but I couldn't help thinking about how many important legal precedents began with someone questioning whether following orders was always the right thing to do. Richard smiled slightly. You're making a constitutional argument at our dinner table. I learned from the best, Margaret replied, returning his smile. But I'm serious, Richard. What happened today matters beyond just us. It's about how institutions maintain their humanity while enforcing necessary boundaries. After dinner, they moved to their small study, where bookshelves lined the walls, legal texts intermingled with historical volumes, a physical representation of their intellectual partnership. I've made a decision, Richard said after a comfortable silence. I'm going to propose changes to the court's security protocols. Margaret raised an eyebrow. Because of what happened to me, that seems excessive. Not because of you specifically, Richard clarified. You were just the canary in the coal mine. The court has been incrementally separating itself from the public for years. It's time to reconsider that approach. The Chief Justice might not appreciate you overstepping into administrative matters, Margaret cautioned. Eleanor will listen. She's been concerned about the court's public standing as well. Richard leaned forward. See, what if we used this incident as an opportunity to create more transparency, not less? What if instead of adding more barriers, we found ways to make the court more accessible while maintaining necessary security? Margaret considered his words. Throughout their marriage, some of Richard's most significant opinions had germinated in these evening conversations, shaped by their mutual questioning and refinement of ideas. You're talking about institutional reform, Margaret said. That's a much bigger conversation than one security checkpoint. Yes, but every significant change begins somewhere. Richard's eyes had the intensity they always did when he was developing a legal theory. The court's strength has never been in its isolation, but in its connection to the principles it upholds and the people it serves. The next morning, Margaret deliberately chose to return to the court. This time, her driver's license was safely tucked in her handbag as she approached the same security checkpoint. Officer Chen was at his post, looking uncomfortable as he recognized her. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitaker," he said formally. "Good morning, Officer Chen," Margaret replied, presenting her identification without prompting. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" The young man relaxed slightly at her cordial tone. "Yes, ma'am. Much warmer than yesterday." Today's session focused on a case involving environmental regulations and state rights. During a brief recess, Margaret slipped out to the court's public cafeteria for tea. She found a quiet corner table, observing the mix of law clerks, journalists, and visitors. At a nearby table, she recognized the young law student from yesterday, poring over notes while absent-mindedly eating a sandwich. On impulse, Margaret approached her. "Mind if I join you?" The young woman looked up, startled, then recognized Margaret. "Of course, please." She hastily moved her papers to make room. "I'm sorry about yesterday, in the security line. I didn't realize—" "Realize what?" Margaret asked, settling across from her. The young woman hesitated. "Who you are. Someone told me afterward." "Who am I?" Margaret asked. "Justice Whitaker's wife. I mean, you have a doctorate in American history, taught at Georgetown, and published 3 books on civil liberties," replied the student Sophia. They discussed legal history and career aspirations. Sophia asked how Margaret maintained her identity while married to someone so prominent. Establish boundaries early. Richard and I made a pact. Neither would sacrifice principles for the other's advancement. In court, Margaret noticed Richard emphasizing how decisions affected ordinary citizens. After the session, Richard revealed, "The Chief Justice suggested forming a committee to review the court's public policy. She wants someone from outside to provide perspective. I can't serve officially. It would appear as nepotism," Margaret said. As an independent consultant with expertise in legal history, Richard clarified. 3 months later, the court entrance was redesigned with new displays and trained staff. Officer Chen, now a coordinator, reported, "Complaints down, throughput increased, threat detection improved." Sophia revealed she had applied to the clerkship program and chosen to focus on administrative law. Tentar novamente. Claude pode cometer erros. Confira sempre as respostas.